In the winter of 1637, in the city of Haarlem, a flower bulb was worth more than a house. Not a chest of them, one bulb, a dry papery lump the size of an onion, and that resemblance, the story goes, is where the trouble started. A sailor, so the famous account runs, came to the counting house of a wealthy merchant to deliver news of a cargo. The merchant, feeling generous, gave him a fine red herring for his breakfast. On his way out, the sailor spotted what he took for an onion lying among the silks and velvets. Seasoning, he reasoned. He pocketed it. He was sitting on a coil of rope finishing the last of his breakfast when the merchant found him. The onion he had just eaten was a tulip bulb, a Semper Augustus, the rarest flower in Holland. By the values of that winter, the sailor's lunch could have fed a ship's crew for a year. He was marched to the magistrates and jailed for months. It is a perfect story. It has greed, absurdity, and a moral you can carry home. For nearly 2 centuries, it has opened almost every account of Tulip Mania ever written. It has been taught in classrooms, cited in banking crises, and quoted by central bankers. And it travels with its siblings. The bulb swapped for 12 acres of land, the nation so besotted that commerce stopped, the crash that ruined Holland for a generation. There is just one problem with it. It almost certainly never happened. No court record, no merchant's complaint, no jailed sailor anywhere in the Dutch archives of 1637. The earliest trail historians have found is much later and much barer. Johann Beckmann, writing in the late 18th century, reports only that, generations before him, a merchant gave a sailor a herring and the sailor ate some tulip bulbs, mistaking them for onions. Beckmann gives no Semper Augustus, no coil of rope, and no prison sentence. In 1841, Charles Mackay supplied the velvet, the Levant cargo, the priceless named bulb, the dockside discovery, and months in jail. He credited a French travel book by Monsieur de Blainville, but Blainville's account of his 1705 journey, published in 1743, contains only a passing sentence on tulip speculation. Economic historian Peter Garber traced Mackay's chapter largely to Beckmann and judged much of its colour to be Mackay's own literary finish. The transmission is not a witness becoming a source. It is a tiny old anecdote becoming scenery, dialogue, a named commodity, and a criminal case. By the time the sailor reaches us, he is carrying 2 centuries of improvements. This is the story of Tulip Mania, the real one and the invented one. They are both worth your time. The real one is about a winter when merchants, innkeepers, and skilled artisans traded promises for flowers that were still asleep underground, and about the strange biology that made one bulb precious and its neighbour worthless. The invented one is about how a small Dutch embarrassment was inflated, retold, and resold until it became the founding myth of financial madness, quoted at every bubble since. The tulip is not Dutch. Before it was a fortune, it was a wildflower, a hardy little thing growing across Central Asia, including the mountain ranges of what are now Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Traders and empires moved it slowly westward, the way they moved everything else. The cultivated flower probably reached Anatolia through Seljuk networks from Central Asia. It was the Ottomans who first made it a courtly treasure. In Istanbul, tulips were bred, ranked and celebrated long before Western Europe adopted them. At the Ottoman court, the tulip was poetry's favourite flower, bred towards slender dagger-pointed petals and judged by connoisseurs against formal standards. The Dutch would later behave as if they had discovered the flower's worth. The Ottomans had simply declined to lose their minds about it. Even the name may be a borrowing gone wrong. European visitors, seeing the flower worn in the folds of a turban, are said to have confused the flower with the headdress, and tulipan, from the word for turban, stuck. No 16th century source records that mix up cleanly, so treat it as a good story rather than a settled fact. The flower reached Western Europe in the mid-1500s. One popular account credits the Habsburg ambassador Ogier Ghiselin de Bousbecq, who supposedly shipped seeds and bulbs home from Constantinople. A story told so often, it has smoothed into fact. But his famous Turkish letters were written down decades after the fact, and botanists now treat the who was first claim with caution. What is documented is the earliest widely cited European printed description. In 1559, the naturalist Conrad Gessner saw a red tulip in the Augsburg garden of the imperial councillor Johann Heinrich Herwarth. Gessner published his description in 1561. And then the flower met the one man who mattered. Carolus Closey Ouse was the most celebrated botanist of his age, a Flemish scholar who had directed the emperor's medicinal garden in Vienna and corresponded with half of learned Europe. Leiden University founded its botanical garden in 1590. Closey Ouse arrived as prefect in 1593 to develop it, bringing his own tulip collection and planting 2 beds of bulbs. Closey Ouse grew them, crossed them, catalogued them, and noticed the thing that would one day drive a market insane. Some tulips, unpredictably, changed. A plain flower, one spring, might come up striped and feathered the next, as if repainted overnight. By then, Closey Ouse had spent decades swapping seeds and bulbs by post with apothecaries, ambassadors, and collectors across the continent. His correspondence made him an important distributor of early European tulips, though bulbs were already growing in Dutch private gardens before he came to Leiden. Wealthy admirers offered to buy his bulbs. Closey Ouse, a collector to his bones, mostly refused. He gave specimens to fellow scholars, and he priced others to discourage the merely rich. Accounts place major thefts from Closey Ouse's Leiden plantings in 1596 and again in 1598, rather than 2 raids in a single winter. The losses helped scatter his collection through private hands. Those bulbs did not leave the country. They went into Dutch gardens and sandy coastal soil well suited to cultivation. They multiplied alongside tulips already held by other collectors. Within a generation, the flower from the mountains of Asia was blooming behind burger houses, from Haarlem to Amsterdam. The Dutch had the tulip. What they did with it next depended on the kind of country Holland had just become. And in the 1620s, there was no country on earth quite like it. If you like stories where a flower can bankrupt a carpenter, this channel is where they live. Subscribing takes a second and costs rather less than a bulb did. By the 1630s, the Dutch Republic was, per head, probably the richest economy in Europe. Which was absurd. It was a damp sliver of delta, half of it below sea level, at war on and off with the largest empire in Europe. And it was winning, commercially at least, at everything. Dutch fleets caught the herring. Dutch hulls carried the Baltic grain. Dutch towns wove and finished the cloth. And Dutch investors owned the crown jewel. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, the spice trading colossus this channel has met before, founded in 1602 and financed through transferable shares. Amsterdam had a public exchange building from 1611 and a municipal exchange bank from 1609. Money moved through the city with unusual reach. Shopkeepers held shares. Widows held annuities. Finance was not merely an aristocrat's game here, it was civic furniture. The city itself was mid-explosion. Amsterdam's population had roughly doubled between 1585 and 1610, then kept climbing. From 1613, the city laid out the first great arc of its canal ring, expanding the port and building new residential districts for a population drawn by work, trade, and religious migration. The physical result was a machine for trade. Ships unloaded into warehouses, warehouse receipts became credit, and merchants could settle business without carrying sacks of coin from key to key. Tulip notes would remain informal and local, but the people writing them lived inside a culture already fluent in paper claims. But Dutch wealth had a peculiar shape. There was no royal court to spend it, and precious few titles to buy. The Republic was run by merchants who dressed in black and worshipped in bare white churches. Calvinist preachers told them their fortunes were a trust from God, to be handled soberly. The fortunes kept growing anyway. So, status went sideways. It went into houses, narrow, deep and gabled, each one a discreet boast. It went into paintings. The Dutch bought pictures on a scale Europe had not seen. One estimate puts Dutch output at well over 1 million paintings. something like 1.33 million, in the 20 years from 1640 to 1659, for a population of roughly 2 million. Probate inventories show oil paintings in broadly middle-class homes, and pictures could cost less than linen or furniture, which set up one of the age's better ironies. A painting of a tulip could cost less than the tulip. Several of the era's great flower still lifes were, in effect, portraits of money. And status went into gardens. A garden was wealth you could display without wearing it, piety and prosperity in the same rectangle. Into that rectangle walked the tulip. Foreign, dazzling, impossible to counterfeit, and, for the finest varieties, genuinely, stubbornly scarce. Owning a great tulip in 1630s, Holland did what a title did elsewhere. It said, "I have arrived and I have taste." Regents, brewers, cloth merchants, and other affluent collectors built gardens and paid serious money for named rarities. That much was ordinary connoisseurship, no stranger than paying for a Rembrandt. The strangeness began when the flower jumped the garden wall, when the trade broadened beyond connoisseurs to networks of merchants, innkeepers, and successful craftsmen, and when buying a tulip increasingly meant buying a paper promise. To understand how a dry brown lump became a financial instrument, you have to understand the flower's one great secret. The most valuable tulips in Holland were valuable because they were sick. Here is the tulip's problem as a product. Grown from seed, it generally takes 5 to 7 years to flower, and the seedling rarely resembles its parent. The only way to copy a tulip exactly is the slow way. Each year the mother bulb produces offsets, small genetic clones budded off her base. 2 in an ordinary year was a useful rule of thumb. A weak bulb might produce fewer. So, the supply of any particular variety grew at the pace of biology, not demand. You could not simply plant more money. And one class of tulip broke every rule. Most tulips wore one colour, but occasionally a plain breeder bulb would transform. Its next flower, striped, feathered, flamed, the colour drawn into fine sharp lines on a pale ground, like fire painted by a miniaturist. The Dutch called such flowers broken. No grower could reliably command which bulb would break, or when, or into what pattern. A florin's worth of plain bulb could wake up priceless. The finest breaks were given names like warships, admiral this, general that, ranks in an army of flowers. And because the flower itself showed for barely 2 weeks a year, the trade ran on portraits. Dealers and collectors assembled books of painted tulips, florilegia, and buyers could order from the images the way a tailor sells from swatches. The catalogue made for Wouter Winkool's collection survives, with 75 watercolours. Above the admirals and the generals stood one emperor. Sem, per, au, gustus. Always the August one. White petals, cut through with flames of deep crimson. The Amsterdam chronicler Enoch Olaas van Vas Segnar, writing in 1625, described a handful of bulbs and one unnamed owner who turned down offers of 2 and then 3,000 guilders. Later writers turned him into a single Amsterdam collector guarding roughly a dozen bulbs. The number and the owner both firmer in the retelling than in the record. For scale, an ordinary working man earned about 300 guilders a year, just under a guilder a day. A senior professor at Leiden might make 1 to 2,000. 5,000 guilders could buy a well-appointed canal house. The reported offers climbed with the years, 1,000 guilders in 1623, more than 3,000 refused in 1625, and 5,500 on later mania price lists. The famous 10,000 guilder peak belongs to later reports and comparisons, not a surviving receipt. Whether anyone ever paid such a sum, no surviving ledger will say. That refusal did what refusals do in a rich small country. It set a price in every imagination. Now the part nobody in Holland knew, nobody on earth would know for another 3 centuries. The breaking was a disease. At the John Innes Horticultural Institution, plant pathologist Dorothy Cayley began her experiments in 1927. In November 1928, she presented evidence that the breaking was caused by an infectious agent. Later work identified tulip breaking virus, spread chiefly by aphids. The virus disrupts pigment in the petals and paints those exquisite feathered lines. It also, slowly, sickens the bulb. Broken tulips lose vigour, produce fewer offsets, and can dwindle toward nothing. The lovelier the flower, the frailer the stock. Sit with the economics of that for a moment. The most desired object in Holland was one whose supply actively shrank as its beauty increased, a luxury that consumed itself. And because growers could not predict infection or its design, every cheap bulb in every modest plot could seem like a lottery ticket. The grandest prize in the garden might come up next spring in a weaver's yard. Scarcity you could not manufacture. Prizes you could not predict. It only remained to solve one problem. How do you run a roaring trade in something that spends most of the year invisible, underground and asleep? Holland's answer to that question was the real invention of Tulip Mania. The flower was incidental. The paper was everything. A tulip's calendar is strict. The bulb comes out of the ground in June when the bloom has died back. It must be replanted by autumn. It flowers briefly in April. So, for the few summer weeks when bulbs sat above ground, you could trade the thing itself. Hand over florins, receive a bulb. The rest of the year, the merchandise was buried in the dark. A buyer in December was buying a promise. This bulb, of this variety, at this weight, to be lifted and delivered in June. Payment would come at delivery. In the meantime, paper. A note of sale, a named bulb, a future date. Holland had backed into building a forward market for flowers. Even the buyers and sellers did not always agree on what they had signed. A firm order for a bulb, or a bet on where its price would land by June. None of this happened at the exchange. The Amsterdam Bourse handled shares, commodities and bills. It had rules, hours and brokers. The tulip trade happened largely in taverns. Traders formed companies, commonly called colleges in modern accounts, that met in the back rooms of inns in Haarlem, Amsterdam and other towns. The colleges had rituals in place of a central market. Deals were chalked on slates, witnessed and recorded on paper. Fines and wine helped the room enforce its customs. There was procedure, of a sort. In one custom, buyer and seller haggled through go-betweens who carried written offers back and forth on little boards. In another, the room bid openly inside a circle chalked on the slate. Trading, as they called it, in the little O. Refused the final price and custom imposed a forfeit. Complete a sale and a separate charge followed. Half a STI Vuur for each contracted guilder, capped at 3 guilders. That wine money was paid by the buyer to the seller, not automatically owed to the tavern. In practice, it often funded refreshments for the company. It was a market whose transaction fee could become the bar tab. As prices rose, precision arrived. Named bulbs were priced by the AHSS, a jeweller's weight of roughly 1/20th of a gram. Common varieties were standardised in parcels of 1,000 AH-zen, or by the local pound. And even the pound was not standard. A Haarlem pound held a few hundred fewer AH-zen than an Amsterdam one. A bulb sold in January by its planting weight could be delivered heavier in June. Even buried, the asset accrued. And the paper began to move on its own. A man who had bought June delivery of a bulb could sell the promise onward. Goldgar found chains as long as 5 transactions, with most shorter, enough to detach several bargains from the flower, but not an endless national daisy chain. The Dutch had a name for dealing in goods one did not own, windhandel, the wind trade, buying and selling air. It was not even a new problem. Provincial edicts in 1610, 1621, 1630, and again in 1636 condemned short sales and other wind trading in shares. The authorities rarely prosecuted the traders. The practical sanction was that courts could refuse to enforce the bargain. Tulip sellers therefore depended heavily on private obligation and reputation. One more door had to open. The great rarities were too scarce to supply a mass market, so the market simply moved down market. Ordinary bulbs, plain one-colour tulips by the pound, became tradable too. Pound goods were the accessible tulip. A skilled artisan could not touch an admiral. He might afford a claim on a pound of common bulbs. And in November 1636, prices for pound goods began to climb like everything else. No central clearinghouse, usually no margin, and no mark to market. no settled body of law for these exact bargains. Just paper, wine, promises, and, from late 1636, prices that rose every week. All it needed now was a reason for everyone to walk through that tavern door at once. That winter, Holland supplied 3. The winter of 1636 into 1637 was the strangest season in Dutch memory, and the tulip was only part of it. In a few months, bulbs that had sold for a handful of guilders were trading for hundreds. Common pound goods multiplied 10 and 20 times over. The rarities appeared on price lists for sums that matched the price of a house, although a quoted or contracted price is not proof that cash changed hands. The names tell the story. Switzer's, a common red and yellow tulip sold by the pound, was offered at 120 guilders on January 15, 1637, at 385 on the 23rd, at 1400 on February 1st, and at 1500 on February 3rd, the last quote landing on the very day the market would break. Other common sorts, the white crowns, the yellow and reds of Leiden, made similarly abrupt runs. The paper changed hands far faster than any bulb could be dug up. Why then? Why that winter? 3 forces stacked on top of one another. First, plague money. The plague was in Holland. It had burned through the towns in 1635 and 1636. In Haarlem that autumn, the city was burying its dead by the thousand, by one estimate something like 1 resident in 7. You can see why historians reached for a connection. Sudden inheritances put money in new hands. Labour grew scarce and wages rose, and death that close can make a man reckless with a signature. It is a tidy theory. The trouble is that the surviving contracts do not show plague money paying for tulips, and the sharpest run-up came as Haarlem's epidemic was already fading. So keep plague money on the list of pressures, not on the list of proven causes. Contemporaries did connect the 2 events morally, describing flower dealing as another sickness. That tells us how the winter felt to witnesses. It does not prove why any buyer signed. Second, paper promises. The wind trade had removed most of the immediate entry fee. You did not need 300 guilders that evening to contract for 300 guilders of tulip. You needed a signature, with payment due at summer delivery. Many buyers at these prices expected to be sellers long before delivery. Some contracts were genuine forward purchases, others were treated as wagers on the difference. The ambiguity mattered only when the music stopped. Third, new traders. Late in 1636, participation broadened beyond the small circle of connoisseurs. The records show merchants, innkeepers, brewers, and skilled master craftsmen. Satire supplied the servants, chimney sweeps, and men selling their tools. Goldgar found no evidence for a nationwide rush of the destitute. The colleges did not take everyone. They worked through credit and acquaintance, so a signature was valuable only if the room knew the name behind it. 6 organised trading companies survive in the records, tied together by occupation, family, religion and neighbourhood. Possible plague money to gamble, paper that postponed payment, a new but still connected crowd. Stack those, and the tavern price of a buried flower stops obeying anything as slow as a garden. For a few weeks, the tulip narrowed the usual social distance. Wealthy merchants and successful artisans could hold the same paper and talk the same jargon. It did not dissolve Dutch class. It briefly gave several prosperous layers of it one dangerous hobby. Some bargains included goods or property rather than pure cash, and contemporary writers loved converting bulb prices into tangible household wealth. But the most famous barter list is an illustration, not a surviving contract for one named buyer. A pamphlet of 1636, its title translates as A Clear Exposure of the Folly, did the famous arithmetic: 2 lasts of wheat, 4 of rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 pigs, 12 sheep, wine, beer, butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a suit of clothes, a bed with linen, and a silver cup. Later retellings add still more, including a ship to carry it all. It comes from a 1636 pamphlet, not a bill of sale, a sermon doing arithmetic. Nobody has produced a bill of sale in which that inventory bought a bulb. The list was polemic before the crash even came, but the prices written in real bargains and auction records were high enough without it. By late January 1637, some colleges were trading deep into the evening. Prices for even ordinary pound goods doubled in days. Every mania has a moment when the arithmetic requires the arrival of a new buyer who does not exist. Holland reached that moment in the first days of February. Tuesday, the 3rd of February, 1637. A college in Haarlem. In the traditional account, an auctioneer offers a parcel of bulbs at the going rate. No hands. He lowers the price. No hands. Lowers it again. Somewhere in that silence, the greatest flower market in history ended. That scene comes chiefly from the satirical dialogue between Gargut and Viamont, printed after the collapse. It places the reversal on February 3rd and describes a pound first offered at 1,250 guilders, then 1,100, then 1,000, each supposed bargain dangled before a room that would not bite. It is our best known near contemporary narrative, but it is dialogue, not auction minutes. Nobody recorded why a particular room went quiet on that particular Tuesday. There was no edict that morning, no failed bank, no bad news off the boats. The safest answer is that demand simply failed at prices sustained by further resale. A market that only knew how to rise had no instructions for standing still. There was no telegraph to carry the panic, so it travelled at the speed of gossip, which in Holland's packed little cities was fast enough. Within days, trading companies in other towns found what Haarlem had found: sellers at every table and buyers suddenly scarce. The surviving record does not give a synchronised map of closures, only a market that ceased generating ordinary prices. Prices did not leave a smooth, downward curve. They became sporadic, disputed, and eventually tiny fractions of the winter quotations. Claims that every bulb fell to pennies within weeks pretend to a precision the documents do not contain. Soon no one could agree what anything was worth, because little was trading. A price is only a fact while somebody will pay it. That February, Holland learned how quickly facts can resign. And here the record preserves one perfect eerie scene. 2 days after the conventional Haarlem break, before the news had fully hardened into fact, the city of Alkmaar held an auction. The innkeeper and bulb grower Wouter Vincoul had died in 1636, leaving 7 children. Their uncles had asked Alkmaar's orphan board to protect the collection in July. Guardians were appointed in August, and the sale was authorised on December 3rd. This was not an improvised last gasp. It was a formally administered estate auction already months in motion. On February 5th, the bulbs and flower seeds brought a recorded total of 90,995 guilders. The tulip lots alone made up the great bulk of it, the rest in flower seeds. These were winning bids and obligations, not proof that 90,000 guilders in coin sat on the clerk's table. On paper, it was the mania's finest hour. In fact, it was the flash of a star already out. The Alkmaar buyers included established flower traders bidding from an illustrated catalogue. A single AHD Rahul Van ENK Hausen bulb was knocked down for 5,200 guilders, over 15 years' wages for a working man. And other named lots ran into the thousands apiece. These are among the hardest numbers the mania produced, written down by a clerk for the orphan's account. What the crash then did to the buyers is far less clear. The Republic was as rich in February as it had been in January. Money had not vanished from the country. What vanished was willingness to bind the next buyer. June still meant delivery. Delivery meant real guilders for paper prices. Every chain of promises ended at people who would have to produce money or persuade a court that they did not owe it. One recent economic explanation adds a botanical signal. Common bulbs planted in autumn began sending up shoots around early February, revealing how much new stock was in the ground. The sight may have punctured beliefs about scarcity. It is a modern hypothesis, not a fact recorded by the auctioneer, but it links the timing of the bust to the one balance sheet no trader could keep hidden: the field. Across a connected group of traders, many seem to have done the same arithmetic within days and reached for the door at once. Goldgar could name about 350 people in the whole affair, a flaw, not a full count since the records are patchy, and of those only 37 spent more than 300 guilders. This was serious money moving inside a small connected world. It was not a whole nation at the tavern table. The market had lasted at full heat perhaps 10 weeks. The argument about who owed whom for it would last rather longer, and, in a way, it has never ended. Now came the question every burst bubble asks: are the promises real? Holland's tulip paper was a genealogist's nightmare. A single buried bulb might sit at the end of several sales, each at a higher price, each seller counting profit he had not received from a buyer who now resisted payment. On February 23rd, delegates from the trading towns met in Amsterdam. On February 24th, they signed a proposed compromise. Contracts made through November 30th, 1636 would stand. Later contracts could be abandoned for 10%, provided buyers gave timely notice and the seller accepted the arrangement. It satisfied approximately no one. Amsterdam's florists would not sign, and the proposal never became binding provincial law. Sellers wanted their prices. Buyers wanted amnesia. The provincial authorities were asked to impose an answer. On April 27th, the States of Holland, acting after advice from the court, suspended final action, while ordering town magistrates to gather information and try to reconcile the parties. Sellers could notify buyers and preserve or resell bulbs, but the resolution deliberately left damages and validity unresolved. Some courts had already declined tulip claims as gambling-like bargains, but there was no instant nationwide rule erasing every contract. Haarlem froze tulip lawsuits that spring. Elsewhere parties sued, arbitrated, settled, or waited. The legal fog was itself the policy. Different towns improvised different rules, and many contracts were resolved by the oldest settlement mechanism in finance, both parties accepting less than the paper demanded. Records show disputes continuing into 1639. Haarlem, the storm's centre, eventually produced the closest thing to a standard. In January 1638, the city appointed 5 commissioners for flower affairs. On May 22nd, it approved guidance that sellers could release defaulting buyers for 3.5% of the contract price. The commission could bind both sides only when both consented to its judgment. 3.5%. A buyer who had promised 1,000 guilders could, if both parties accepted the commission's resolution, end the dispute for 35. It was not an automatic cancellation statute, but it became the figure history remembered. Which brings us to the great missing scene. Where is the wreckage? The legend demands ruined thousands, a nation in mourning for its money. The archives declined to supply it. Dutch commerce sailed on. Grain moved, cloth moved, herring moved. Modern economic histories find no national depression or financial system failure caused by tulips. The trade was too small and too detached from banks to produce one. Goldgar found no bankruptcy she could attribute solely to tulip dealing. Most bargains were executory promises, so many of the apparent losses were vanished gains or disputed claims rather than money already paid. That did not make every participant whole. It limited the path from broken promise to macroeconomic ruin. There were true casualties, men who paid real money or accepted real obligations. The landscape painter Jan van Goyen bought tulips in early February 1637 and died insolvent in 1656. But he also speculated heavily in land, and the 19 intervening years make a tulip-only diagnosis impossible. Mostly, the tulip's durable casualty was not national wealth. It was something a Dutch merchant priced far higher. This was a commercial society that ran on credit and reputation, where a signature substituted for collateral and a name opened doors. In 10 weeks, a small world of connected traders watched acquaintances dispute signatures they had given freely. 3.5% helped settle some accounts. It did not settle the shame, and shame, it turned out, wanted a story. The crash was barely a month old when the presses began, and with them began the second longer life of Tulip Mania, its career as a story. First came the moral pamphlets. More than 30 tulip pamphlets survive across the 17th and 18th centuries, and roughly 3 dozen printed texts cluster around the mania itself. They include songs, dialogues, sermons, and farces. Holland scolding itself in print. The most important are 3 1637 dialogues between Gihar Gut, whose name means greedy goods, and Weermont, true mouth. Printed in Haarlem by Adriaan Roman from February through May, they preserved names, rituals, prices, and gossip, while arranging all of it as moral comedy. They are indispensable evidence and interested witnesses. There were ballads too, and mock elegies, and printed funerals for Flora, goddess of flowers. The record supports burials on paper more securely than literal funeral processions in the street. For a season, laughing at florists was practically a Dutch industry, the one tulip product that never lost its value. Painters piled on. Jan Bruegel the Younger's satire on Tulip Mania, made around 1640, populated the trade with monkeys. Hendrik Pot's Flora's Wagon of Fools, painted around 1637, sent flower-crowned speculators rolling behind their goddess. The point was identical. Look what greed does to sensible people. Nobody fact-checks a sermon. The pamphlet's job was moral, so their numbers were theatrical, and their numbers were what survived. Second came the copied numbers. Beginning in 1780, the Göttingen professor, Johann Beckmann, published a history of inventions that retold Tulip Mania from Dutch compilations and old moral literature. An English translation followed in the 1790s. Beckmann repeated the goods basket and the sailor's herring, and his account became the main conduit into later histories. Historians copied him. Encyclopedias copied the historians. With each copy, the satire's flourishes hardened a little further into fact. By the 1800s, the joke inventory of oxen and cheeses was being cited as a market price. Third came the bestseller. In 1841, a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay published a book with a title for the ages: Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. His tulip chapter had everything: the elaborated sailor and his ruinous breakfast, a bulb traded for 12 acres of building land, a whole nation's commerce paralysed by flowers. The land claim was older than Mackay. It goes back to an offer of 12 emorgen of land, morgen being a Dutch unit, not acres, recorded in the 1636 pamphlet tradition, and in notes later reported by the botanist Abraham Munting. Beckmann rendered the unit as 12 acres. Mackay moved it again to prime Haarlem building ground. It remains a pamphlet lineage claim, not a registered deed. The sailor story travelled differently. Mackay said it came from Blainville, whose 1705 travel account was published in 1743. Garber found only a single general sentence there about tulip speculation. Mackay's actual narrative follows Beckmann, then expands him. The book remains in print and is still recommended in finance, which means generations of readers learned the tulip story from Mackay, the satire and hearsay of earlier centuries, passed down as testimony with the seams hidden. Satire mistaken for testimony, testimony compounded by copying, copying perfected by a storyteller. That is the machine that built the tulip legend, and it has never once stopped printing. One detail elevates Mackay from author to exhibit. 3 years after his book first appeared, he became editor of the Glasgow Argus, as Britain inflated the great railway share mania of the 1840s. Mackay did not recognise the pattern from inside. His paper promoted railway expansion, and on October 2, 1845, as doubts gathered, he wrote, "There is no reason whatever to fear a crash." The crash came. The man who wrote the book on madness of crowds could not spot one from inside. Keep that on file. It is the whole moral of this channel, arriving a century early. So, what actually happened once you subtract the sermon? In the past few decades, historians have gone back to the paper, the notary records, the wills, the court filings of the actual 1630s. The mania they found was real, and it was small. Goldgar could put names to roughly 350 people, while stressing that the figure is a flaw, not a full count. Most were successful merchants and skilled artisans, people with something to lose, and usually the means to survive it. and only 37 of them spent more than 300 guilders. The same names recur, deed after deed: relatives, co-religionists, colleagues, neighbours from the same few streets. Up close, the tulip trade looks less like a national fever and more like a fashion tearing through connected clubs. It was concentrated in towns of Holland, ran hot for about one winter, and then entered years of settlement. No banks failed because of it. No industry stopped. The Republic's golden age rolled on for decades. Economist Peter Garber pushed further and argued that prices for rare novelty bulbs need not be irrational. A new variety began scarce, multiplied slowly, and then depreciated rapidly as offsets increased its supply. 19th century hyacinth prices followed a similar path. He did not show that every 1637 price made sense. The explosive winter rise and collapse in common bulbs remains the hardest part of the fundamentals case. As a national financial event, Tulip Mania barely qualifies as a footnote. As a story, it conquered the world. The interesting question is why. Part of the answer is that the story is useful. Every generation gets a mania of its own, and every generation reaches for the tulip to explain it. When London went mad for South Sea shares, pamphleteers reached back to the tulip. They have been reaching for it at every bubble since: railways, radio stocks, dot-coms, digital coins. The flower has outlived every market it was compared to. Part of the answer is simpler. It is a perfect story. A flower worth a house needs no footnotes. The sailor's breakfast survives because it deserves to be true, which is precisely the trait that should make a careful person check. And part of the answer is the uncomfortable one. The legend says, those people were fools, unlike us. The ledger says something worse. The people in the taverns were ordinary, shrewd, and modern. Trading instruments we still trade, for reasons we still have, in a market that worked right up until the moment everyone tried to leave it at once. The Dutch did not invent financial madness that winter. They invented something more durable, the story we tell to convince ourselves it only happens to other people. The tulips, for their part, came up on schedule that April. Holland planted them the next autumn, and the one after. The flower was never the problem. 83 years after the taverns of Haarlem went quiet, England built a bubble of its own, bigger, better organised, and run from the top. Parliament sponsored it. The story of the South Sea Company is on this channel now.